Good afternoon, Nebraska educators. My name is Amy Roan, and I'm the administrator for the Office of Special Education at the Nebraska Department of Education, as well as the Nebraska MTSS State Lead. As a part of the Nebraska Department of Education LaunchNE efforts, the Nebraska MTSS team is excited to bring you week 1 of our 5-week SEL summer series. This series will focus on social emotional learning from an adult perspective and inform participants of best practices that improve school culture, teacher efficacy, and school and student outcomes. The 5 webinars cover 5 interdependent topic areas, which are adapted from the Nebraska MTSS SEL Systems Development Training offered by the NEMTSS team and serve as complements to the core SEL training provided by NEMTSS. Educators of all types were encouraged to participate in this series to grow in their SEL competency and practice and learn similar to the Launch Nebraska original 8-week series. We will be making these available to anyone to view and learn from after each presentation. Today I'm excited to introduce you to Laura Barrett, one of our Nebraska MTSS co-state coordinators, and George Toman, the Nebraska PBIS coordinator, who will be bringing you today's conversation around adult social emotional learning and professional culture. Our hope is that today will be as interactive as possible considering the webinar format, and we would ask that you participate as you can during the discussion times by entering your comments and thoughts in the chat, as well as any questions you may have in the question and answer box. We will be monitoring these and hopefully asking for more participation or answering your questions live or within the chat answer box as well. So sit back, relax, and get ready to launch into the beginnings of the Nebraska MTSS Summer SEL webinar series with adult social emotional learning and professional culture. Take it away, George and Laura.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate that intro. Just a quick little background in addition to what Amy said. Your Nebraska MTSS team has been working very diligently over the last 3 to 4 months, working on various projects, including building our resources for social emotional learning in the state. This presentation, along with our next 5, are going to contribute to that conversation and hopefully give you some tools as you enter into the next following school year. So as Amy said, we're very happy to be on and very excited and pleased to know there's many educators on the Zoom call today.
All right, we're going to go ahead and we'll just give you a little bit of background on us. So George, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm George Toman. I'm the PBIS coordinator for the state, and I'm currently in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Right. And I'm Laura Barrett. I am newly into the role of co-coordination for Nebraska MTSS. I am housed out of in Western Nebraska, and so I'm excited to continue to work with this team. You can see at the bottom of the screen there is a bit.ly for our handouts, but I'm also going to share a link to that same document right now, and we'll be referencing that throughout the presentation. There's a link to our slides if you need any of that, and we'll jump in. Maybe if I can get going. All right, so this is what we hope you learn out of today's session. So we're first going to talk a little bit about adult SEL and what it is and why it's essential, why we're starting with that. We as a team met and talked through where to start, and we really do believe that we need to talk about that. But then we're also going to spend quite a bit of time on that professional culture and how do we develop that environment within our school that's fostering it for our adults so that our students can have that healthy school as well. So we're going to work through these throughout our time together. Our time will go very quickly. It's going to be an hour up before we know it. So George and I will try not to talk too fast. It's a little harder for me than for George, but we will get information. If you have questions, just let us know.
All righty. So to begin our conversation today, we want to begin by discussing adult social emotional learning as our focus. And in our work across the state and also what we see nationally, we know this is sometimes maybe difficult for some educators to understand at first. Why do we need to look at ourselves before giving maybe necessarily something to our students? Can't we just buy second step and be able to implement, and all of a sudden we have a social emotional learning school curriculum, et cetera? Our challenge to you today, and as how it will be in the next following months as we continue our social emotional learning together as a state, is that skills must be first cultivated in adults to improve the student outcomes. And we have bolded it, italicized it, and underlined it here that adults are the primary agents of change. And when we think of social emotional learning, a proper way to look at it is similar to what we know from even our restorative practices, that rather social emotional learning being to students, it's with students. So the more that adults can learn with the students about social emotional learning, the better chance we have of students actually absorbing that information and being able to replicate that in ways that will help not only them in their educational outcomes, but even more profoundly in the culture and also elsewhere. When we think of adult social emotional learning, as we cultivate it, the fruit of that is increased patience and empathy, good communication, safe, healthy learning environments. We also know that increasing social emotional learning contributes to teacher retention. It contributes to wellness. It contributes to collaboration. All of those good things that we know positively impact schools and also, most importantly, improving student outcomes. Also, this allows us to be better models of what we're talking about with students, because compared to maybe teaching a lesson to a student, like academically, we're looking at social emotional learning in the sense of, look, all of us here have social emotional learning needs. And the more that we can grow in those needs together, grow in those skills together, the better off all of us will become. And all of us in our own personal experience, I'm sure, can remember a time or two when your best learning didn't happen because some teacher just told you what to do, but they experienced it with you. They shared things with you. And so one of the powers of social emotional learning is that as we share with our students the good and the difficulties in learning some of these skills and competencies, our students will see us more in that human context and be able to connect more and be able to answer some of those tougher questions. Bring your attention real quick to the quote at the bottom of this slide. Although 87% of educators are aware of the importance of social emotional learning, less than half of practicing teachers report being provided with resources, training, or professional development in adult SEL. And so again, there's a little bit of a confusion here, right? We know the importance of SEL, but at the same time, we don't necessarily build that SEL component with our adults. And again, they go together. The more that adults are aware of their SEL abilities, the better the students will be as well. And that ultimately empowers your school and your culture.
So I want you to just read this quote here. And if you have ever been in the classroom, had your own children, I think we have all experienced this. One of those parts is children are going to imitate those behaviors that we see. And so it's really important that we as adults take care and have focused on our social emotional competencies to be able to be that, so we can model for students what we want to see in the classroom. And what I find really interesting about this quote is that this quote is from 1960. This is not something that is brand new that we're talking about this. This is something that we've had for it. And so we need to intentionally start with our adults, because if we don't intentionally start with ourselves and we are telling kids, you need to do this, you need to do that, here's this behavior, they're not going to do that because they're not seeing us do that. They're not seeing that happen within there. And so we always think this is a great quote to be able to start remembering that they're imitating us more than they're just doing from listening to us. So adult SEL is really that process of helping the educators build their expertise and skills to lead the social emotional learning initiatives within their classrooms. So it requires adults to focus on their own social emotional competencies. And there has been research out there that shows that Teachers who are just told, here's, George mentioned second step, here's second step, go ahead, implement it. They actually have worse outcomes if they aren't focusing on their own social emotional learning as well as a part of that. So if they haven't first thought about themselves and what does this mean, we're actually negatively impacting kids by having somebody who isn't practicing what they preach in that situation. And so it's really important that we take time to look at it. And so we're going to talk throughout the next few minutes on ways that we should do it. But I think we need to come back to remembering that this isn't something that we have talked about a lot in the past. And so it's new, and for some people to hear that we're focusing on this from the adult side. We've talked a lot about it from the student side, but we really want to think about how we do that for it. So some of the things that if you are a building administrator, if you're a teacher leader, or someone within your building is you need to start looking at how do we build that expertise, that social emotional learning within our own district to help with bringing up that social emotional competency in our district. Some ways that places have done that is they've looked at peer mentorship programs. So when you're mentoring new teachers, having that as a part of your onboarding process, how are we helping integrate this and teaching our adults how to manage their emotions within that. We also need to talk about self-care and wellness programs for staff. I know there are certain things that are offered through like EHA. There are things that are out there that are already in place. How do we use those to really create a culture within our environments that focuses on the health of our staff? Because shortages are everywhere. We're seeing them. There's still advertisements. People are trying to hire teachers. We don't want teachers flowing out the door because they haven't been able to take care of themselves during it. And it's going to be really important when we start up in the fall. And, I'm starting to see plans come out of what school opening looks like. Teachers are stressed right now. Students are stressed. Families are stressed. So how can we focus on supporting those adults when they come back into our buildings?
All right. So to get more specific in our conversation, as what Laura alluded to, I want you to pay specific focus to this image in front of us. Get big props to our social emotional learning subcommittee within the Nebraska MTSS team. They work very hard to help gather information and make things relevant for Nebraska educators, and I wanted to give them a shout out, as some of them are on the Zoom today. This image in front of you is actually adapted from CASEL. CASEL is kind of the hub for social emotional learning. Many of you have probably already accessed material from CASEL to help with your social emotional needs, or maybe have inquired about it at some point. You will notice that in this image, there's various colors. And you also notice words that look similar to our MTSS essential elements, and there's no coincidence that's exactly what happened. We took this CASEL image and basically adapted it to our Nebraska MTSS, particularly our shared element, the essential elements: shared leadership, communication, collaboration, partnerships, database decision making. And we took all the different professional culture elements and then put them with our own Nebraska MTSS elements to show you the intermix of the two. Because again, it's not with SEL, academics, behavior, and whatnot, it's all about the interconnected system, or in other words, our MTSS that we're hoping for. Because if we treat things in silos, things don't happen well at all. And so we want to make it very intentional to show the interconnectedness of all of these. Paying attention to the quote here on to your right, fostering adult SEL focuses first on creating a professional culture that supports and promotes the social and emotional well-being of the educators. Going back to what Laura said, very important that we enable the culture that allows us to be able to embrace that social and emotional learning. And as a quick example right now, just as a little sub point to help maybe illustrate it for some of you who may not see what we're getting at, in social emotional learning, one of the things that we talk about a lot is self-knowledge and self-regulation. And if you're in a classroom learning self-regulation skills or self-knowledge skills, and you're a student and you notice that the teacher in front of you can barely do their own regulation or barely know anything about their own self-knowledge, I don't care what program you have, that kid is not going to listen to you, right? Similar to adults. When we're in a webinar like this, or when we're in some kind of presentation around the country, whatever, or what have you, we hear what the speaker is saying, but at the same time, we're looking at what they're doing. We're watching their behavior closely to see if they align. And if they don't align, We may not walk out of that conference or that presentation with too much conviction that this thing is good for us. But if they are aligned, where behaviors and message align together, all of a sudden we leave walking away with not only giving them a 5-star rating, but also more importantly, thinking that, hey, this is actually pretty good for our schools. And so with social emotional learning, it's the very same concept. Not only must we teach social emotional learning, but we must be social emotional learners. And that's very important to what we have going on today. So on our next slide, we're going to go into each of these elements of professional culture. And we're also going to give you a little bit of time to be able to think about how this applies to your school and give you some ideas. So what Laura and I are going to do is that we're going to trade off back and forth with each of these different elements. And then we're going to set the timer. And then in the chat, what we like for you to do is to think about how can this topic be implemented? And then what questions do you have? Just please put that in the chat box as we get to it. And so to begin, let's talk about adult social and emotional competencies, the very tip of this image here. And so for a quick definition, these are key skills that teachers need to create a positive teaching and learning environment. A focus on adult social and emotional competencies lays the foundation for creating a professional culture, as they provide opportunities for adults to be aware of their own skills, emotions, and biases, and form relationships with their colleagues, families, and stakeholders. And as a quick reminder too, that link that you got, that bit.ly, also has all of this on there as well. So you can go ahead and take a look at that too as part of this exercise. But as an example for adult social and emotional competencies, so I kind of alluded to it, but now I'm going to kind of broaden out even a little bit more. Let's talk about self-regulation as an example. It's a skill. It's something that we use to help us stay regulated so we can handle all the emotions and feelings of the day. And walking into a school year that many of us, again, it's going to require a lot of flexibility and a lot of change from some of the traditions and practices that we've done. Thinking about how we're emotionally regulated helps us determine, are we going to be able to learn? And also, how are we going to be behaving when things happen a certain way? So when we think of adult social emotional competency, like self-regulation, for instance here, when we think about that, are our teachers and our staff aware of their own emotions and feelings? Are they able to actually take time to be able to reflect and look and see what's going on? When times are tough, do they have a support system around them to be able to build them up and not tear them down? Those and many other things could be contributed to the adult social emotional competency. And the more that we have an idea of those SEL pieces, the more that then we can not only teach it to our kids, but also example and model that out, because our kids are going to watch our behavior first before they listen to what we have to say. And so now, looking at both the handout and your screen in front of you here, think about how can this element of professional culture be implemented in your school? And then what questions do you have? Go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll give you 2 minutes to do that.
What we will do is we'll let you guys process for a little while and bring out some of those questions, and we will start to answer. Some we will be able to give you answers and resources now, and some we might say, you know, look for something coming in the future. But we're going to give you just a couple minutes here as you're reading through some of those resources. I see we have some responses coming in, so keep those coming.
So as we get closer to our time being up, a couple things that some participants have already mentioned. One being to make an opportunity for reflection and journaling, maybe through intentional prompts to be able to reflect on kind of what's happened. That's a very good way to help kind of build some of those social and emotional competencies in adults. Also, the opportunity to be able to look at their own strengths and also areas of growth, having your teachers, your staff, what have you, be able to give a self-evaluation about what's going on with them and what they can contribute good. And then also where are some of their identified weaknesses that they have, and then being able to kind of collaborate together as to how we can improve. And incorporating guided discussion. I like this. Someone's already got some good SEL background here on the chat. Incorporate good SEL guided discussion into learning team time. And so an example here is that if you have a good PLC process and you're having that collaborative time amongst adults, maybe incorporating some of this SEL piece into that would be a very good practice to have some of that nice reflection. It's already built in. You just add a little piece there to enhance the product. So very, very good. Thank you for those responses. Laura, anything else you see that you want to answer?
I see one, just a question about screeners, and we are working on providing some, if you reach out to one of the NEMTSS group that we have, we'll list our contact information at the end. We're trying to compile some of those together. There are a variety of them that are out there, but we'll go from there. All right, we're going to jump on to the next one. Is that all right, George?
Let's do it.
Okay, so cultural responsiveness. This is that next pillar, that next part of when we're looking at adult social emotional learning. What do we need to have in there? So our definition for that is it's the ability to interact with others in ways that validate and build on their cultural backgrounds. This entails developing certain personal and interpersonal skills that enable educators to teach all students in a culturally responsive way. And so as we think about this one, we really need to think about some examples would be is looking at, does the culture of our school match the culture of our community? Do we have representation of individuals from our community on our school boards, our school councils? Does it represent our ethnic makeup of our community, our religious makeup of our community, our gender representative, all of that? How are we making sure that when decisions are made, they're not being made just simply by people who have come into the area and are in the schools, but that they really are reflective of our schools? And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is look at the membership of your advisory committees that you have. And how are you making sure that your discipline policies are culturally responsive based on what you have in your district? It's going to look completely different from you than the school district who is an hour down the road. And that's one of the great things about schools is we have that individuality, but how are we focusing on that? So what I would like you to do is there's a document linked in there that's called Creating Culturally Responsive Schools. And I would like to hear from you guys of how you have implemented it, how it could be implemented within your school, and what questions you have about becoming more culturally responsive in relation to social emotional learning. I'll start the 2-minute timer, so go ahead and look at that.
I just want to say you're all doing very well. There's already been some real good questions brought out, so keep it coming.
I know, I kind of wish I was like in a place where I could provide like something like tangible reinforcement for everybody who's doing that, but virtual high fives will have to do like for you. You guys are getting high fives, fist bumps, or because we don't actually do high fives anymore. We throw elbows, or I saw one like you throw the bones, whatever it is. We're saying hi and good job. I know, right, George? You would approve of it. We've decided that's our official family greeting from here on out. We don't shake hands, we throw the bones, but told you guys I would get distracted. Okay, so I'm seeing some great questions in here talking about how do we integrate multiple cultures into one school culture. So no community, it doesn't seem like just one group that's coming in, but there's a variety of that. And I think that's a really good question, and one to, as you sit down with your team, to decide how do we encourage them to be a part of the conversation, encouraging them to do that. But I saw a couple other suggestions of having culture nights. So if there's a variety within your community of just even honoring, showcasing that. I've seen some schools do that. Looking at the different norms of cultures, and this is one, if you read through that article, that it talks about that, of how it's very different in how individuals interact, how they interact with peers, how they interact with other adults. And so that's an important question on here about how do we bring this up to our administration. If I'm a teacher and maybe feeling, oh, my buzzer's going off. I was talking and I didn't see it was getting close. If I'm a teacher and I see that this is going on, and I think that's a really good question and a great conversation to have with your administrator, of bringing up, not as accusatory, because none of us are intentionally leaving groups of people out, but we want to bring it up and offer that as a suggestion of how can we bring that in there. We see questions of looking at surveys for getting input about their cultures. There are a lot of great surveys out there. Is there something that you could share? Asking families that, of bringing it in. So there are a variety of different areas in doing that. And I like this one from Casey. I think you said, know your students and who they are as humans, and building relationships as families. And the last one that I get to talk about today is our family and community engagement and partnerships. And I think that is such a huge part of this cultural responsiveness. We weren't all raised, we were raised in our own culture. It takes learning from somebody else to understand somebody else's culture. So offering and opening that door to them to help teach you in that. So George, do you see anything in there?
Nope, a couple of things I just wanted to add with what you just said, Laura. If you are in a situation where, and I think all of us are in this situation, but if you have multiple cultures happening in your building, how do you embrace it to be one? And the whole unity and diversity piece kind of comes out here too. It's already been mentioned even in some of the comments of being able to embrace what's happening in front of you, the different cultures that are there. When more people are embraced, when more people are valued, you can still have your differences, but you can at least see the common vision that we're all in here together, driving on some good purpose. And so when you have that situation going on, being able to embrace everything that's there, and then making the most of it. And again, I think you might surprise yourself with what you'll be able to accomplish with that kind of togetherness. One thing that did get pointed out that I think is important for our discussion too, is that what happens when you have a lot of conflicts, right? When the community may not support the culture one way or the other, however that looks like. And my recommendation there, and again, Laura, contribute if you have something else here, but it's important that people are heard and listened to, because a lot of times when there's division within a culture, it's because people don't believe they're heard. And so when they believe that they're not heard, they'll go to other alternatives to show what they just wanted to say peacefully or in some other means. And so when you have that kind of conflict going on, good or bad, it's important that voices come at the table, the necessary ones, to be able to figure out, okay, we didn't hear you before, now I want to hear you here. And then making some kind of plan together to show that solidarity, to show that unity. And usually when those things occur, again, it's human emotions, feelings, those get tough. But when you're able to kind of see through those things, then things improve a lot quicker than maybe you have ever thought. And so those are some things I wanted to add. Laura, anything else before we get to our next slide?
No, but I think it flies right into that next part of looking at our implicit bias. So. Yeah,
and I honestly, I didn't even prep for that segue. That was good there. So so examining implicit bias. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but I know for me at least, when the word or phrase implicit bias comes up, sometimes there's a shiver in the room and it's like, ooh, here we go. What are we going to talk about? And objectively speaking, examining implicit bias is this: looking closely and objectively, keyword objectively, at the attitudes and stereotypes that unconsciously, another keyword, affect people's perceptions, actions, and decisions. And so traditionally, implicit bias has been seen in the area of race and of other similar issues. But I want to even extend the definition just a little bit for our sake, make it hit more at home with something personal for me. So I'm a school psychologist by training. And one of the things that we're asked to do is to help provide verifications for students who may need special education and related services. And one of the classic verifications that always gave the wide-eyed was emotional disturbance. And with emotional disturbance, we have multiple categories underneath that, right? But whenever we hear the phrase ED or behavior disorder, or whatever the case is, what a lot of people think, I'm not saying all, but what a lot of people think at times is they think of the kid who's going to throw a chair, maybe throw a punch at me, spit in my face, etc. Whereas emotional disturbance could be a kid who is extremely depressed, have extreme anxiety, or there's something else going on that's so atypical that we can't explain it with any other kind of verification, and it's emotionally related. But you see, we can have a bias there in that if I have an IEP come in my way and says, oh, emotional disturbance, I'm thinking this kid's a chair thrower. Unconsciously, I think that because in my experience, that's what I have. That may not be the truth when you actually see the student and you realize that, oh, when I look at the file a little bit more and see this kid, this is an incredibly depressed child, one that really needs a little more love and support in that sense. And so again, traditionally, we've always seen implicit bias in terms of like race and those things. But again, it can expand to other areas as well. Even I would say, and I could argue, that if you've had a poor experience with another teacher or another administrator, whatever the case have you, you might think of a new person coming in and go, oh, he or she is just like the previous one. You're biasing that person based on previous experience. And one of our goals is to not do that, right? Because that person might be very good and we got to give them that credit of doubt. But again, that's that bias coming out in our situation. So again, it can be applied in multiple settings. But our example of how to examine implicit bias, and this is a big one here. One, in schools, I think a good example is being able to look at, let's have an honest, trustworthy conversation. Let's have a confident conversation, and all of us here make a safe environment and say, what's going on? Why are we seeing the situation, this kid, the situation, the subgroup, what have you? Why are we seeing him in that way? Having that honest talk in a safe space, being able to do that with people that we trust and be able to kind of work together is paramount, and an example of what this looks like in terms of examining implicit bias. Because remember, folks, if you don't have trust and if you don't have good conflict going on, you won't be able to get to the bottom of some of these issues. And so examining implicit bias, again, building that trustworthy environment and building that opportunity where people are not afraid to have some healthy conflict. So with all that said, Laura, if you don't mind starting the timer, think about how could this be implemented in your school, and then whatever questions you may have, please put them in the chat. So I'll quickly say someone pointed out that they're already doing a staff survey on implicit bias. So that's good. Already encouraging the conversation through a survey and evaluating that data. We have another comment. We are creatures of our experience. Great line. Great line. And the first step is getting people to recognize and own what's going on rather than to deny. I think that's huge. Taking that ownership to be able to look at it and be able to try to find some ways to move forward. Self-reflection has also been mentioned. Very, very important. And again, recognizing that biases are something that is something about who we are, right? Those are things that we have within us. And again, sometimes maybe that might take a negative context for some, but again, we have those biases, and being able to recognize them, good or bad, helps us get better at the end of the day. Good stuff. Keep it coming.
All right. And so I'm going to go to the next section, and we're going to talk a little bit about adult self-care. And so, people have this vision of adult self-care of like bathtub and like you're just sitting there relaxing, and we have to move beyond that as our vision of what adult self-care is. And so I really like this definition of it that says actions taken over an extended period of time that have a meaningful impact on one's overall well-being. To successfully engage in adult self-care, educators use their social-emotional competencies to become aware of what triggers provoke emotional reactions, and to use self-management strategies to actively promote their own well-being. So we can't just avoid the situations altogether. We're going to be in stressful situations all throughout our lives. And so what adult self-care is really about, recognizing that, and then how do we take care of ourselves and find different ways to release that tension or to rejuvenate ourselves once we've maybe had that depleted. And so there's a variety of ways out there. Some of mindfulness techniques are very effective in helping with doing that. But another thing that really is helpful is journaling, writing down your feelings, something as simple as talking about how you're feeling throughout the day. There's a great strategy out there of writing down three good things that happened to you during the day, and that simply helps you start focusing on that. But a very important part of adult self-care, especially for teachers, administrators, those of us, our speech pathologists, or everyone who's in the field of education, we are helpers. We are helpers for everyone. We want to be there, do everything for them. But we have to learn how to set boundaries, and working with each other, working with our colleagues, ourselves on how do we set appropriate boundaries so that we can be rejuvenated and be full for doing that job. And so those are some examples of adult self-care that I think are good. But go ahead, take a couple minutes, look through that. I want to hear what you guys either have done in your schools for promoting self-care, or other things that you've heard other places do, or questions you have about it. So I'm going to start the timer now. And the first comment I see that has come in, and it is so true, of talking to each other, having your colleagues there, sometimes just having that person that's been through a shared experience or that is willing to listen through that is really, really helpful. That is great. And I like the sharing, going around the room, other people expressing how they're feeling and understanding that people are going through that. Prioritization of what needs to be done.
Laura, one thing that's been mentioned, and I want to emphasize it, is just respecting one another's time. So if you say a meeting is from 8:30 to 9:30, you stick to it and you respect each other's time, because that's the time that you allowed, unless it's something obviously extraordinary that you got to talk about. But in a lot of times we can get our material done. Even encouraging that coworker who's really, really working a lot, and you realize that the more that they're here, the less efficient they are. Finding ways to be able to say, hey, go out for coffee, get out of here, being able to find that kind of self-care and encouraging that. Those sometimes go a lot farther than any kind of big program or event that you do. Those little things really, really matter, because people are encountering people.
I'm seeing a couple other comments on there about just even building that relationship and taking time, like you said, getting coffee, going out for, appetizers after work on a Friday or something along those lines, but enjoying that together. A suggestion that is given for because people are asking, how do we get places to prioritize this? How are schools doing it? Some have said half of the staff development day each semester focused on that leading self-care activities. So some examples were yoga, meditation, sports, so basketball, whatever you have in your facility, you could work on that. Walking clubs, book clubs, anything that promotes that positive social interaction. So this is something that I think we're going to really need to focus on as school comes back in, and teachers have been kind of relatively isolated. Maybe they've been through Zoom or other interactions over the summer. It's gotten a little bit more interactive, but how do we help people come back together and get that sense of community back in? So George, we're going to move on to the next one so we can make sure and get through.
Absolutely. And Laura, we won't do the activity here at the end. I'll quickly explain this. I want to get to the family school partnerships at the other end. But professional learning and supports, and specifically we'll talk about professional learning supports through collaborative relationships or partnerships. So as a quick definition, these are systems and support structures that allow educators to collaborate and learn from one another, ensuring that all educators feel responsible for the social, emotional, and academic development of all students, and staff. And so, again, just like we cannot expect good teaching to happen without good professional learning regarding teaching, the same applies here with social emotional learning. We need to have good, high-quality professional learning and supports, primarily through the systems we've already embedded, again, making them better than what they are, to be able to help us with the social emotional learning. And so the example that quickly highlighted earlier was if you already have your professional learning community time set aside where you're talking about student needs, system needs, et cetera, having time to maybe insert some social and emotional activities or a prompt or two to have your people consistently and frequently talking about what's going on and bringing those things up, especially in some of those times where you know things are emotionally high wired and whatnot. And we're going to have a lot of them in the next school year for sure, whether we like it or not. Also, thinking about those opportunities, even like going back to meetings. Again, a high quality meeting, people feel empowered. A poor quality meeting, people feel devalued and probably have a lot of questions about what's going on. And so taking time to really look at all of our different professional learning, and again, thinking properly, a meeting can be a very good professional learning opportunity because you're talking about students or staff or whatever, what have you. Being able to really find ways to make valuable strides and making those high quality helps assist this professional learning piece and enables that opportunity for a very strong professional based culture. So now our next slide, we won't do the activity just because of time. We want to get to family community engagement. So Laura.
And as I alluded to earlier, as we talk about the culture of the responsiveness, this family community engagement is very similar in making sure that we're doing that, but we're meaningfully and intentionally engaging our families and our communities in authentic and active involvement into our efforts. And so this requires access, it requires opportunities for that involvement, and it has to have that clear bidirectional relationship. It's not just about the school gathering their input and getting things from them, but it's how can we support and have that reciprocal relationship. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember as we're talking about our relationships with our communities and with our families, is how do we make sure that that's a two-way relationship street. We have to have all of those competencies, so all of that we talked about earlier has to be in place to be able to truly engage with families in that. And so some examples of ways to do this would be looking, how do we involve families in if we're doing SEL activities within our school, how do we involve them? How do we make sure that they understand them? Is it they have opportunities to do some of the lessons too, or provide their input, or come in and teach some of it, or how do you interact with the community so that you can do that? I know you guys have provided quite a few opportunities for thinking through that, and but I do want to spend just a little bit of time for you guys to jump into those questions that we asked, to talk about how can we implement it, because this family involvement one is when we talk with districts, this is something that a lot of districts struggle with, is getting great family involvement. So you all-stars out there, share your comments and I will share them out. And if there are other questions that you have, we will do that. But what has worked well for you in having families and communities involved in your SEL processes? So there's a question out there of how do other schools get parents involved in the middle school PTA? As the mother of a middle school parent, I'm not very good at being there, so I get that's a good question. So anybody out there, if you guys have ideas on how to get parents involved in the middle school PTA, making it meaningful would be one of them, I think is good, but it's hard because they've fallen off from that elementary, we're super excited, we're all in, to middle school. Other questions, thoughts on that? Parent versus student dodgeball tournament. Excellent idea. What middle school child does not want to throw a dodgeball at their parent? And if you add teachers in there as well, I think that gets a lot of excitement and gets people in. I like it. Students presenting projects, parents coming in. All right. Thank you all for your input. So that's kind of that big picture of all the components that need to be thought about as we're looking at implementing adult SEL. We're going to move now into professional culture and talking a little bit about that. So we all know this, but this is the important part. A good quality professional culture does all of these things listed on the screen. It's going to improve job satisfaction. This is actually a research study that lists all of these. It engages educators in the decision-making process. We're increasing student achievement. But right now, I have a contest for you. I would like you to guess what year was this article published, the one that we're referencing in this that has all of this. What year do you think this was published? And you can type your answer in the chat as I list through some more of them. The strong professional culture is going to have that collaborative practice, reflecting on our data-driven. Oh, we have a guess of 1978, 2068, 70s. It's not quite that old. It is actually from 2005, but we're sitting and that's quite a while ago. And so we know this, yet I think there's still a need for us to continue to focus because I don't think we're quite there. In all of our buildings. And I think we've all experienced or seen places where that haven't had a strong focus on it. So we really want to make sure that we have a culture that promotes that shared responsibility for the development in a culturally responsive way, and how do we move forward in that. So that's what we're going to spend the next part of our time on. I love quotes from Brene Brown, and I think this one about connection and our school culture is really about that. It's that energy that exists between people. And if you've had opportunity, watch her videos. She has some great ones about that relationship. But I like this quote from Ebony Birdwell Mitchell from the Harvard Graduate School. It said, "A culture will be strong or weak depending on the interactions between the people in the organization." If you think back to that graphic that we had earlier, if there is not a strong relationship between the people in the organization, it's going to be very hard to focus on all of those areas and to have meaningful conversations. And so some of the comments that I know you guys have had and that I've heard from others in this is when it's really hard to have these conversations, that's when it's become part of our culture that we don't, and it's difficult to move forward in that. So what we want to focus on is how do we move forward in our core beliefs. And so there are 5 areas here that in order to move your culture towards one that focuses on this, you have to focus on all of these areas. And so the first one is figuring out what the fundamental beliefs and assumptions are of our school. So our definition of that is things that people consider to be true or people at your school consider to be true. So we might think this is all students have the potential to succeed, or all teachers are responsible for all students. But we have to first have that core belief in what we're talking about. So we have to have the core belief that adult SEL is an important component of our school health. Then once we have that shared, those fundamental beliefs, we move into our shared values. And it's those judgments that people make about your school, about the beliefs and assumptions, whether they are right, wrong, good or bad or unjust. Those are the things that people see of you. And so some might say it's wrong. Some of our kindergartners might not receive the same opportunity to graduate from college, or parents must feel welcome to want to be active participants in their learning. So knowing about that. Norms, those of you that have been through any PLC training or any sort of group meeting, you know norms, that's how we think people should act in a meeting. So we say we all should be present and engaged in our weekly grade level meetings, but actually our patterns and behaviors are how we're actually doing it. So we have to move beyond just saying our norms are that we're going to do all of this, but your next step is saying our behaviors is what we are actually doing in the meetings. So we're actually engaged in those weekly team meetings talking about students. We're actually engaged. We're actually we're devoting time to social emotional learning for adults. We're devoting a half day of our professional learning to adult self-care. That's an actual behavior that is now then that last step of the tangible evidence that we have that shows that these behaviors are happening in our schools, because maybe we have something showcasing what's happening within the district, or we have meeting notices that have all of that information included in it. And so when you think back and you think, okay, we're still struggling in some of these areas, it's good for a team to reflect back. And what George is going to do now is help guide you through how you as a team can think back of how do we pinpoint where we need to target our time and energy in moving forward.
All right. So one of the things, and if you've been through our Nebraska MTSS core systems trainings, as I like to call them, you will have seen this problem-solving process alive and well. It's in all of our presentations. It's in all the things that we're going to do. And also with social emotional learning, you're going to see a lot of it. The beauty of a problem-solving process is that when feelings and emotions are very high, you can use the process to help reorient the behaviors and have a guided discussion if you're very intentional about it. So again, the professional culture informs the school climate, and a good way to achieve that, a good engine, is using our problem-solving process. And so the first thing we want to do with the problem-solving process is identify. So what is occurring? So you already got information on the professional culture elements and also the core beliefs. So an activity you can bring back to your buildings. And even if you wanted to in the chat right now, feel free to add some things as I'm talking to you. But what professional culture elements are already prevalent within your building, your school, your district, whatever representation you might be here in this meeting? What's already there? What's already being done? So are we looking at adult social and emotional competencies? Are we looking at cultural responsiveness and being sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our students, truly being equitable and not just maybe putting on a mask, if you will, and saying that we are? Examining implicit bias, looking at, all right, why are we having some of these unconscious beliefs at the table and being able to address them? Do we have professional learning that's assisting with our social and emotional learning? And then what does our family and community engagement look like? And more importantly, is that really providing an impact on the student learning one way or the other? And then going to the core beliefs. What core beliefs are evident on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, within a school year? What are those core beliefs? So what are the fundamental beliefs and assumptions? If you're big into DeFore's PLC stuff, then you know that one of the first things, the first activities that you do as a building is fundamental beliefs and assumptions. It's a huge part of being able to establish what's going on in the building. And so that's what you do first. Shared values. What are those? What are those things that we all have in common? What are those values that we have that help drive our performances? Those norms, the patterns of behavior. And then what evidence do we have supporting that? And so then when we get done with identifying, we then get to the analysis part. Now, some of you already mentioned this in some of the comments, but I'll reiterate, we want to have some good data here as much as we can. But again, since we're dealing with beliefs and those kind of things, a lot of times we'll have to stick to our qualitative data, which is completely fine. So we might have surveys out there. We do have a Nebraska MTSS core belief survey. We adapted it from another state and have basically called it our own. And if you are interested in having that core belief survey come about, then ask your regional facilitator. They'd be more than happy to assist you to have that as part of a resource for you. Also looking at some of the school climate surveys that the Department of Ed has already had. Those surveys, being able to look at things. Very, very important. And then the other qualitative data. What are our staff talking about? What are our stakeholders talking about? The only way that we can know that is by asking them in an appropriate way. It's very bad if we just try to guess just based on our own beliefs about what's going on. So it's really important that we try to engage as much as possible. What are our staff feeling? What is our community feeling? And being true to the observations that we have. When we say observational, we're not necessarily talking about doing a direct observation, going into a classroom and seeing all this kind of stuff. But simply just looking at the tone of your staff, looking at the feelings of what's going on. How's the morale doing? Again, we know that from the business sector especially, that having some kind of emotional intelligence, and in our conversation here, having some kind of cognitive awareness of social emotional learning and just social emotional things in general helps us understand the benefits of our school and our community. And so having those things is very, very important, because when we do have them, then it helps us kind of move forward. And so really quick, let me go ahead. Oh, there we go. And then know your audience. Really important. There's the element of gathering school information, right? But if you're in a bigger district where you have multiple schools and everything, a lot of schools could be at different places, right? And so being able to understand, all right, from a school perspective, what is available? What do people need? And then from a district perspective, what does the district need to be able to help with social emotional learning, evaluating professional culture? Because again, maybe the district can do something that will help the schools, and maybe the schools can do something that can help the district, and be able to work more as a tag team to help student outcomes, maybe then in silos. And so again, know your audience, be able to analyze that data, be able to look at it and have those good, honest conversations. And then Laura will talk about implementing and reflecting. Oh, sorry, one more slide here. As we analyze, form what's going on, we also make a plan. We make a plan by asking, what are the strengths that we've identified as a team? What are we really good at? And it's really important, folks, that we emphasize pointing out strengths, because when we point out strengths, we allow for our people to understand that, look, you are valued and you bring something to the table. And then when we have to bring up the areas of improvement, rather than those being seen as punitive, if we stress the point of, look, you are valued, you have strengths, here's how you can contribute to help fill the gaps, that goes a lot easier and better than the reverse conversation, which happens, oh, we have a couple strengths, but we have a lot of weaknesses, so we got to fix things. And then people don't feel valued. They feel like they're not worthy or they're not good enough. And when you have that kind of attitude in a building, it's tough to have success, whether we like to admit it or not. And so by emphasizing the strengths, authentic strengths, genuine strengths, and then being able to use those strengths to help us figure out, hey, here are some areas of weakness that we might have, areas of improvement. How can the strengths that we have currently at the table contribute to make those better? And then what kind of plan do we have, or what kind of plan do we need to create to help drive that? And one thing that we do recommend is that we do have a communication plan, the Nebraska MTSS communication plan, that when you have some of those meetings and those discussions, you can jot some of those ideas down. And then at the next time you have a meeting or the next time you have some kind of conversation about it, you can use that writing to be able to assist you in moving forward. So now Laura will talk about implementing and revising the plan.
Yeah, so you go, you do these great surveys, you build this really great plan, and then what? And so sometimes this is where we fall off, is we start to do something, but we don't revisit and come back in it. And so a really important part that we want to emphasize as a part of your true problem solving model is that you have to decide, how are we going to, one, implement it? How do we get it in place? And we've built that plan, and now let's actually start doing it. But what is our plan for reflecting? It's not enough just to say, hey, here was the issue, here's how we're going to solve it, and go forth and conquer. We have to make sure that we come back to say, okay, is what we put in place working? Was our goal of involving more families in that process? How are we effective? How do we measure that? Is our goal of increasing looking at our adult SEL? How did we do that? How are our teachers doing? How are our teachers feeling? What is our process for doing that? And you see, it's that circle we continue to do. And so you're going to collect more data. It's going to be continuous. It can't just be a one time we build the plan, it's going to work and move on. And so as you're designing that action plan that George was just talking about, I always want to emphasize, how are we going to reflect back on this? What is our process for revisiting it and coming to it again? And so one activity that I would like for you guys, we're not going to do it right now, but I want you to think about doing is in thinking about all you've learned today. And if you go look at your district's organizational mission statement, most likely it says something like, achieving greatness for students, or there's like huge big words we use in our activity or in our mission statements. But what I want you to do is as a team who's focusing on this, look at your mission statement and think about, how do we live out our mission statement? What do we as adults in our school need in order to be able to live out our mission statement? And then you can, as a group, also talk about what gets in the way of us achieving that mission. Is that some of the adult social emotional competencies that we talked about today? And then you can set a goal of, how do we address those barriers? And so that would be a really great, as you're thinking about some of your reentry plans, a good thing for a part of your team to discuss. We are at the end of our time, In your handouts, you have links to all of our information. So we have some of us that are statewide. We have some regional facilitators. We have early childhood facilitators. Like, we've got really great people here to support you. So we want you to feel free, reach out to us. We want to remind you of all of the other webinar series that are coming up. Please get registered for those. There are some really other members of our team are going to be presenting, and it's going to be really great. So we can't wait to see you all on there. And we want to give one more plug for the Nebraska MTSS Summit that will be happening in the fall. And so we're excited. We're also going to be continuing focusing on SEL and some students in that. So with that, there's some references at the end. If you have questions, you can type those in the chat. But I want to thank you for your time and honoring time. We are done. George, any parting words?
Nope. Thank you so much. And again, please consider joining us for future weeks as we continue this series, because all of these are designed to help you. So please access them as you are able. So thank you so much.